The Follings arrived in the quiet village of Darlington on a damp autumn morning, their carriage wheels creaking against the narrow cobblestone streets. The town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, had seen little change in its 100-year history. Its residents were simple folk, and the arrival of outsiders was always met with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But the Follings did not appear as strangers. They seemed like a perfect fit for this peaceful, isolated place. Edward and Eleanor Folling, the husband and wife at the center of the arrival, were in their mid-40s, their faces smooth and serene, their movements composed. They carried an air of quiet grace, but there was something cold about them, something that made even the most welcoming villagers hesitate. Edward was a tall man with broad shoulders and dark, sharp eyes that seemed to study everything with clinical precision. Eleanor, his wife, had a soft smile and a calm demeanor, but there was a stiffness in her posture, a rigidity that spoke of control, not warmth. The couple appeared to be wealthy, though they did not flaunt it. Their clothes were fine but simple, their carriage polished but without the extravagance of a noble's crest. They moved through the village like they had always belonged, and the villagers, for the most part, accepted them as part of the landscape. It wasn't long before the Follings became known for their charitable acts. They began adopting children from all over England, orphans from poor families, or those abandoned by society. The villagers had heard the whispers of their past in other towns. A noble couple with no children of their own, now dedicating their lives to raising those cast aside by the world. It was an act of kindness, surely, but there was something unsettling in the way they went about it. The children were always young, no more than 5 or 6 when they arrived. They came from various parts of the country, their histories scattered like broken memories. The Follings never spoke of where the children came from, and no one ever seemed to ask. It was as if the past had been erased from their lives entirely. The Follings' house stood on the edge of the village, perched atop a hill that overlooked the surrounding valley. It was a large, imposing structure built from gray stone and ivy-covered brick. From a distance, it seemed like an old manor, the kind that had seen centuries of history pass by. Up close, however, the house seemed cold and unwelcoming. The windows were always shut tight, and the doors, though never locked, gave the impression that they were rarely opened. The grounds were neat, too neat, as if every blade of grass had been trimmed with deliberate care. There was a sense of sterility in the air, like the house was a monument to something more than just a home. As the Follings' adopted children settled into the house, odd things began to happen. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about the children's strange behavior, how they would avoid eye contact, their faces hollow and distant. Sometimes a child would be seen walking alone in the woods at night, eyes glazed over as if in a trance. The Follings themselves never seemed disturbed by these strange occurrences. In fact, they acted as though everything was perfectly normal. They would speak of their family with such warmth and care, as though they had built something beautiful. But there was always a hint of detachment in their voices, a coldness hidden beneath their kind words. One winter's evening, a local woman named Margaret, who had worked for the Follings as a maid, went to the house to deliver some linens. When she arrived, she was greeted by Eleanor, who invited her inside with a forced smile. Margaret had always found Eleanor's smile unsettling, but she had learned to ignore it, knowing that the Follings were not the type of people to be questioned. Still, as she walked through the grand hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too quiet, the silence pressing down on her. She noticed the children, 6 of them, all sitting in a row in the large sitting room, their eyes vacant, their faces pale. They didn't speak, not even to greet her. Margaret hurriedly dropped off the linens and left, but as she stepped outside, she glanced back at the house and saw Edward standing in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. It wasn't long after that the rumors began. It started with whispers from the village elders, people who had lived in Darlington long enough to know when something wasn't right. They spoke of a strange aura around the Follings home, a feeling that grew stronger the longer one stayed near it. Some claimed that the house had a peculiar smell, something faint but nauseating. Others said they had seen shadows moving behind the curtains when no one was inside. But the most chilling rumor of all was that the children, once they had been adopted, never seemed to grow older. They remained the same age for years, their eyes always the same hollow, vacant stare. Despite the whispers, no one dared to speak openly about the Follings. The couple had established themselves as pillars of the community, their wealth and influence slowly woven into the fabric of village life. No one dared to risk their reputation or livelihood by making accusations. And so, the Follings continued to live in their grand, cold house, their secrets well kept. But the tension in Darlington was palpable. Something was happening in that house, something that none of the villagers could quite understand. And as the days passed, the suspicion grew, spreading like a shadow across the quiet village. The Follings' arrival had been marked by kindness and charity, but there was a darkness hiding behind their polished smiles. A darkness that would soon reveal itself to be far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Henry Ashford had always prided himself on his sharp instincts. A man of methodical observation and quiet resolution, he had seen much in his years as the village doctor. But there was something about the Follings' house that unsettled him. Something hidden beneath the veneer of their outwardly perfect life. The couple's adoption of children, seemingly done out of charity, was not unusual in a town where poverty often left families desperate. What unnerved Ashford, however, was the secrecy that surrounded the Follings household. He had attended to the children as any doctor would, but each visit left him with more questions than answers. Their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stayed with him long after they had left his office. The children were always brought to him with the same pale faces, their eyes fixed in a distant stare as if they had not yet found their place in the world. They never spoke of their past, and when Ashford tried to ask, they would simply look away, as though afraid to remember. It was Eleanor who had first drawn Ashford's attention. Her polite, perfect manner belied something darker beneath the surface. She was too controlled, too immaculate in her demeanor. When they had first met, she had exuded an air of kindness, but Ashford, who had seen many faces in his time, felt a coldness behind her smile, a smile that never reached her eyes. He knew that look. It was the same look he had seen in people who were too practiced at hiding their true selves, people who wore masks to disguise their intentions. But it was Edward who truly unsettled him. The man's gaze was sharp, always measuring, never letting anything slip. The Follings were not just wealthy, they were powerful, and their wealth seemed to come from places that Ashford could not understand. The children they adopted came from various parts of England, yet none of them seemed to have a proper history. There were no records of their births, no known families, no traces of their past. It was as if they had been plucked from nowhere, given new names, and erased from existence. This, to Ashford, was the first sign that something was wrong. One afternoon, Ashford was summoned to the Follings house under the guise of checking on one of the children, a boy named Thomas. He was 8, but his small frame and vacant stare made him appear much younger. When Ashford arrived, he was shown into the familiar parlor, but this time something felt different. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence. The Follings greeted him as they always did, polite, distant, but this time Ashford noticed a subtle tension in their movements, a stiffness to their posture that was new. It was Eleanor who led him to the child, and as they walked down the long, shadowed hallway, Ashford could not shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into something far more sinister than he had anticipated. Thomas was seated in a small room at the back of the house, a place Ashford had never seen before. The boy sat on a wooden chair, staring at the wall, his body unnaturally still. He did not acknowledge Ashford's presence, and for a moment Ashford wondered if the child was even aware of his surroundings. His eyes were wide but lifeless, as though they had seen too much for a child so young. There was a hollowness to him that made Ashford's skin crawl. The boy's pale skin seemed almost translucent, and his fingers twitched ever so slightly as if controlled by some unseen force. Ashford knelt in front of him, trying to elicit a response, but the child did not speak. Instead, he simply whispered almost inaudibly a single word: "Room." Ashford's blood ran cold, the word carrying an eerie weight. It was a word the boy should not have known, a word that hinted at something far darker than Ashford had anticipated. "What room?" Ashford asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. But before the boy could speak again, Eleanor stepped forward, her smile fixed in place, but her eyes narrowed, as if warning him not to pry. "He's just tired," she said, her voice too smooth, too practiced. "It's been a long day." Ashford felt the weight of her gaze, but he ignored it, choosing instead to focus on Thomas. The boy's eyes seemed to lose focus again, drifting away, as though the room itself had consumed his attention. Ashford knew better than to believe the excuse. He had seen enough in his time to recognize when something was deeply wrong, and this was more than just exhaustion. That night, Ashford could not sleep. He kept thinking about the boy, about the strange way he had looked at him, about the chilling whisper. He had to know more. He had to understand what was happening in that house. The next morning, Ashford returned to the Follings house, telling them he needed to check on Thomas once again. This time, however, he was determined to see beyond the carefully constructed facade of the Follings home. The moment he entered, he noticed the change. The air was heavier than before, the house quieter. He was led once more to the back of the house, but this time the door to the room was slightly ajar. Ashford hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. What he saw made his stomach twist. The room was bare except for a wooden table at the center, and there in the corner was a strange metal contraption. It was a chair, but it had been modified in a way that made it look almost like a cage. The walls were bare, and the air smelled faintly of something sharp, something metallic. Ashford stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He quickly turned, but it was too late. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze so cold it felt as though it could freeze the very air around him. "I told you," she said, her voice a soft hiss, "that you wouldn't understand." In that moment, Ashford realized the truth. The Follings were not simply adopting children. They were taking them for something far more twisted, something that twisted the very essence of what it meant to be human. They were using these children for rituals, for purposes that Ashford could not yet comprehend, but the horror was undeniable. There was a method to their madness, a system of control that ran deep within the walls of that house. The children were nothing more than pawns in a game too dark for anyone to see. As Ashford stepped back, trying to find the words to protest, Eleanor smiled, a smile that seemed to swallow the light in the room. "You should go now," she said softly, as if nothing had happened. "You're not meant to know." Dr. Henry Ashford had always trusted in the power of facts. As the village's doctor, he had seen the frailty of the human body, its aches and pains, its delicate weaknesses. But the more he learned about the Follings, the more it became clear that their influence extended far beyond the realm of the physical. What he had initially dismissed as rumors now gnawed at him like a wound that refused to heal. The more he dug into their past, the darker the picture became. The Follings were not just wealthy, their wealth was built upon a foundation soaked in blood and fear, a truth that was far worse than he had imagined. He first learned of their past through an old letter he found hidden in the back of his medical cabinet, tucked between dusty books on anatomy and herbal remedies. It was a letter from a colleague, a former physician who had worked alongside the Follings in the early days of their rise. The letter was filled with strange language, references to rituals and unnatural experiments that left Ashford questioning his own sanity. Words like extraction, vital essence, and renewal were scattered across the pages as though the writer had been trying to make sense of something he couldn't understand. The letter spoke of a secret chamber beneath the Follings' home, an area that had been sealed off after a failed experiment. The physician claimed that the Follings had become obsessed with prolonging life, using unspeakable methods to try to tap into the very essence of life itself. Ashford's hand trembled as he read those words, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. He had always trusted science, but now, in the face of this knowledge, he could not dismiss what he was reading as mere delusion. He had to know more. His next step was to speak to those who had known the Follings before they had come to Darlington. He started with the town of Ravensford, where the couple had lived for years before their arrival. There he encountered a man named Gregory Harris, a former acquaintance of Edward Folling. Harris was an older man now, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with age and regret. But when Ashford brought up the Follings, Harris's eyes darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. At first he was reluctant to speak. But after some persuasion, he told Ashford of the Follings' origins. It was here in Ravensford that the couple had first made their fortune, though not through legitimate means. They had bought up vast tracts of land at a fraction of the price, taking advantage of desperate families who had been forced to sell in order to survive. But the real secret of their wealth, Harris claimed, lay in the hidden work they had been involved in. Work that had involved the very people they had exploited. According to Harris, Edward Folling had made a deal with certain influential figures at court, figures who had promised to help him rise in power in exchange for certain favors. These favors, it seemed, were the lives of those who had been discarded by society, orphans, the poor, the sick, anyone who could be used for their twisted experiments. The Follings' real wealth, Harris claimed, came not from land or business, but from these dark, ritualistic practices. They had found ways to manipulate life itself, using occult methods to extract life force from their victims, prolonging their own lives in exchange for the lives of others. The more Harris spoke, the more Ashford's mind raced. His pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Follings weren't just corrupt businessmen, they were part of something much darker, something that reached into the very heart of power. Ashford's investigation took him deeper into the shadowy world of the royal court. Through whispers and secret meetings with former servants and court physicians, he learned that the Follings had made powerful allies within the highest echelons of society. The royal court had long been known for its secrets, its hidden intrigues, and the Follings had taken full advantage of this. They had gained the favor of certain key figures, using their connections to cover up their dark deeds. One name kept coming up in these conversations: Lord Ashcombe, a high-ranking noble with influence over royal medical matters. It was said that Lord Ashcombe had been the one to introduce Edward Folling to the court's most secretive practices, offering him the knowledge that would allow him to unlock the power he so desperately sought. Lord Ashcombe's name was always spoken with a sense of fear and awe, and Ashford began to realize just how deeply the Follings were embedded in the fabric of the power structure. They had managed to carve out their own place in the world, hiding behind a mask of charity and good intentions, all the while committing unspeakable acts in the name of their own survival. The deeper Ashford delved into the Follings' past, the more he understood the true horror of their methods. They had used people like cattle, exploiting them for their life force, draining them of their essence in the name of some twisted, forbidden science. The Follings had never cared for the people they adopted. They had only used them as tools to further their own power. They had created a system of control, a web of lies that spanned generations, all to maintain their own grip on life and death. And Ashford, trapped in the middle of it, now realized just how dangerous they were. He could no longer pretend that they were simply eccentric or misguided. They were evil, methodical, and far more powerful than he had ever imagined. As the days passed, Ashford felt a growing dread in his chest. He could not ignore the truth he had uncovered, but he also knew that revealing it would not be without consequences. The Follings had powerful allies, people who would stop at nothing to protect their own. And if Ashford was to expose the Follings for what they truly were, He would have to confront not only the horrors of their actions, but the very system that had allowed them to thrive. He was no longer simply investigating a couple of disturbed individuals. He was challenging an institution of corruption and death, one that had been hidden beneath the guise of nobility and power. And in doing so, he would risk everything. The Follings' home, grand and isolated atop the hill, was not merely a place of residence. It was a temple, a shrine to the darkness that had consumed their lives for years. Beneath its cold stone exterior, the house held secrets that no outsider would ever guess. Secrets woven into the very walls and floors, into the air that seemed to press down on those who entered. It was a house of manipulation, of power, and most terrifying of all, of ritual. Edward and Eleanor Falling had long abandoned the pretense of kindness. The children they adopted, who were in truth no more than vessels for their occult practices, had become mere tools in their pursuit of immortality. The Fallings were not content with wealth alone. They desired something far more elusive, life itself, or rather the power to control it. They had found a way to tap into forces beyond human comprehension, forces passed down through secret societies, through generations of occult knowledge buried beneath the foundations of time. In the stillness of their home, the rituals began. The children were always chosen with the utmost care. They were not taken from their parents by mere accident. They were carefully selected, hand-picked from the most vulnerable of society. Orphans, runaways, the neglected, these were the ones the Follings favored. And once they had arrived at the house, their lives were no longer their own. They were trained, not in the ways of normal childhood, but in the rituals that would feed the Fallings' insatiable thirst for power. Every morning they would be led into the vast dining hall. The heavy scent of incense thickened the air. The Follings themselves, dressed in long black robes adorned with symbols no one dared understand, would stand at the head of the room, silent as the children assembled in a line. The children's faces were often empty, hollow, as if drained by the very atmosphere of the house. Their eyes were dull, unfocused, their spirits crushed long before they arrived. But it was in these mornings that the first ritual would take place. Eleanor Falling would begin the ceremony with a chant, her voice soft and low, almost like a murmur against the silence of the house. It was a language that no one knew, its meaning lost to history. But it didn't need to be understood, it only needed to be said. The Follings had learned long ago that the power was not in the words themselves, but in the force they summoned through repetition, through belief. Edward would stand beside her, his hand resting on the head of one of the children. The child would flinch at his touch, but they would not be allowed to pull away. The Follings had perfected the art of psychological control, breaking their victims down until they were nothing more than obedient vessels for their dark purposes. And once the ritual began, there was no turning back. The first act of the ritual was always bloodletting. The children, having been starved and weakened by days of isolation, were forced to kneel before the altar. A simple stone slab at the center of the room. They were told it was a cleansing, a way to purify them. But in truth it was a sacrifice. Edward would take a sharp dagger, its blade cold and unyielding, and press it to the child's wrist. With a single swift motion he would cut, letting the blood spill freely onto the stone. The child's screams would echo through the room, but no one would react. The Follings had long ago grown numb to the sound. The blood was caught in a bowl beneath the altar, where it would be mixed with herbs and oils. Eleanor would then take the bowl, placing her hands around it as if offering a prayer to something unseen. It was during this moment, when the ritual reached its most intense, that the true purpose of the Follings' practices became clear. They were draining the life from the children, taking their vitality and using it to fuel their own. The process was slow but deliberate. Each drop of blood that fell into the bowl was a piece of life force stolen, not just from the children, but from the very concept of time itself. The Follings had learned how to manipulate the flow of life, stretching it, bending it to their will. The children, weak and broken, were nothing more than pawns in a game that stretched across generations. They would be sacrificed, but not immediately. No, their lives would be used in stages, their essence drained slowly over time until they were no more than husks. Their vitality would be transferred, their souls trapped, bound to the Follings by an ancient pact that no one could break. The Follings had perfected this ritual over the years, refining it until it became an unholy art. There were many rituals, many ways to manipulate life, but this one, this slow, painful process of bloodletting and essence draining, was the cornerstone of their power. And the more they performed it, the longer they lived, the more their wealth and influence grew. Their names were whispered in the halls of power, their wealth known only to those who needed to know. But all the while, the Follings' fortune was built on the broken lives of children, on the stolen life force of those too innocent to understand what was happening. The children, for their part, became little more than shadows of themselves. As the weeks passed, they grew thinner, weaker. Their faces became gaunt, their eyes ever more vacant. The process of draining their vitality was gradual but unrelenting. They would be placed in the ritual chamber, laid bare beneath the weight of the symbols, their bodies exposed to the rituals that slowly consumed them. And in the silence of the house, while the Follings chanted and conducted their ceremonies, the children would lie still, their spirits slowly fading away. But the Follings never seemed to notice. They were too focused on the rituals, on the power they could extract from the suffering. The cries of the children, the desperate pleas, were nothing more than a background noise to the Follings' work. The ceremonies were not limited to bloodletting alone. There were other rituals, darker, more dangerous in their effects. One involved a twisted device of metal and leather that would be strapped to the children's bodies. The device was designed to restrict their breathing, to deprive them of air for a time. The Follings believed that by doing so they could weaken the body, forcing the spirit to fight against the restraints, to pull at the threads of life itself. It was a form of torture, yes, but it was also a way to prolong the ritual, to extract every last drop of vitality before the child's body gave out. The device would be removed before they suffocated, of course, but the fear and suffering were part of the process. Every gasp for air, every moment of panic was a payment to the forces they had bargained with. As the months wore on, the Follings' wealth and power continued to grow. The rituals had worked. They had found the key to life's persistence. The children's suffering had become a necessary price to pay for the immortality they sought. But there was a dark truth that the Follings refused to acknowledge. With each sacrifice, with each ritual, something had begun to change. The house, once a place of order and control, had started to take on a life of its own. The walls seemed to breathe with a strange energy, the very air humming with an unnatural force. And in the quiet moments when the rituals paused, the Follings would feel a cold presence in the room, something watching, something ancient and powerful that demanded its own price for the power they had sought. The rituals were not without consequence, but the Follings, blinded by their greed, could not see the danger that was coming for them. And with each new child, with each new sacrifice, they unknowingly inched closer to the very thing they feared most, the power that they had awakened, a power that could no longer be controlled. Elizabeth had always known something was wrong with the Follings house, but it wasn't until the day she escaped that she truly understood the horror that had been suffocating her life. The night had fallen quietly over Darlington, the streets empty as the fog crept over the town like a living thing. Elizabeth, no older than 14, had been weak from days of deprivation, her body thin and frail from the constant rituals. But the pull of freedom was stronger than the pain. She had waited for this moment for months, watching the patterns of the house, waiting for an opportunity to slip away unnoticed. That night, it came. The household was silent, the Follings busy with their dark ceremonies, leaving her alone for once to slip from the shadows. She had crawled out of the small window in the back of the house, her heart pounding in her chest as she dropped to the ground below. The world outside was colder than she remembered, the air sharp in her lungs as she ran through the thick mist, desperate to put distance between herself and the house that had held her captive for so long. When she reached the village, she found herself on the doorstep of the town's constable, a man named William Ford. He had known the Follings only as benefactors, their wealth and presence in the village unquestioned. But to Elizabeth, Ford was her last hope. She banged on his door, her voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from the years of silence the Follings had imposed upon her. The constable opened the door, his face softening when he saw the trembling girl standing before him, drenched in the cold night air, her eyes wide with terror. "Elizabeth?" he had asked, his voice gentle, confused. "What's happened?" Elizabeth's words tumbled out, broken and frenzied, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the horrors she had endured. She spoke of the rituals, the bloodletting, the whispered chants, and the sacrifices. She told him of the children, of their hollow eyes and empty faces, of the Follings' unholy practices. Every word that left her mouth seemed to weigh her down more, as if simply telling the truth would make the nightmare real. She begged him for help, for someone to listen, to stop the Follings from taking more children, more lives. Ford listened in silence, his face pale, but as the details of her tale unfolded, something in his demeanor changed. It wasn't disbelief that clouded his expression, but something darker, something that made Elizabeth's heart sink. The door opened wider, and behind Ford, two men stepped into the frame. His associates, two figures Elizabeth recognized only by their cold, calculating stares. They were no friends of hers. One was a tall, thin man with a sharp jaw, a man whose gaze had always made her skin crawl, and the other a stout, muscular figure with an expression that never softened, even in the presence of children. The men closed in around Elizabeth, their hands reaching out to grasp her with a quiet but forceful grip. "It's all right, girl," Ford had said, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. "You're safe now." But Elizabeth knew, as the men's hands tightened on her arms, that she was far from safe. In that moment, she understood the truth she had feared. No one was going to save her. The constable was not the ally she had hoped for. He was part of the Follings web, just another thread in their dark empire. The next thing Elizabeth remembered was waking in the Follings house once more. The walls of her room were the same as they had been before. The cold stone, the heavy drapes blocking out the light, the silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. She had been drugged, her mind clouded, and when she awoke, the house seemed darker than it ever had been. The Follings, however, appeared untouched by the events of the night. Eleanor stood at the foot of her bed, her expression serene, but there was an unmistakable hardness in her eyes. Edward had not yet returned, but she could feel his presence lurking in the house, as if the Follings had known all along that Elizabeth would not be allowed to escape for long. "You were foolish to try," Eleanor said, her voice soft, almost pitying. "You should have known better." Elizabeth's body was still sore from the struggle, the ache of the men's hands still fresh on her skin. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the exhaustion and terror were too much. There was no fight left in her. The Follings had broken her down piece by piece until she was nothing more than a shell. The room seemed to close in on her as Eleanor stepped closer, a cold smile twisting her lips. "You will learn, my dear," Eleanor whispered, as if the words were meant to be a gentle comfort. "There is no escaping what you have become." The wordless horror of her return was too much to bear, the weight of it crushing down on Elizabeth's chest. The village had heard her cries, but the Follings had ensured that they would not be believed. Ford, with his false promises of protection, had betrayed her just as surely as the Follings had done. The town would never know what had truly happened. The children who had vanished, the ones who had suffered, would remain nothing more than whispers in the wind. And Elizabeth? She would become another story, another nameless face lost in the sea of unspoken horrors. Days turned into weeks. The town of Darlington went on as it always had. The Follings continued their facade of benevolence, their wealth untouched, their influence unchallenged. And Elizabeth, silenced once more, became a ghost in the house. Her body still, her eyes hollow, her spirit crushed under the weight of what she had seen and what had been done to her. The rituals continued, the sacrifices made in silence, hidden behind locked doors. The children, her friends, the ones she had once known, were no more than broken puppets. Their lives slowly drained away, their cries stifled by the same quiet terror that had consumed her. Elizabeth's brief glimpse of freedom was nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting moment of hope before it was ripped away, swallowed by the vast, all-encompassing darkness of the Follings' reign. The truth, too horrible to be spoken, was buried once again beneath layers of silence and denial. The village, like the world outside, would continue as it always had, never knowing the depths of the nightmare that lay just beneath the surface. And Elizabeth, like so many others before her, would fade into nothingness, her story silenced, her suffering unseen. The Follings had won again. Their hold was unbroken. Dr. Henry Ashford's mind felt like it was fracturing with every passing day. The weight of what he had uncovered about the Follings' dark empire pressed down on him like a stone. His rational mind, built upon years of study, experience, and dedication to the Hippocratic Oath, struggled to find a way to reconcile the horrors he had witnessed with his responsibility as a doctor. The children he had treated, once so full of life, were now but shells of themselves, hollow-eyed and frail, drained of any semblance of joy or vitality. But it was not just the children that haunted him. It was the realization that this family, these two monstrous individuals, had reached far beyond their small, isolated home. Their influence was insidious, creeping into the very fabric of society, contaminating even the institutions that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable. The more Ashford dug, the more he discovered that the Follings' power was not confined to their grand house on the hill. It was far-reaching, stretching into the political and medical fields, supported by a web of connections that had been carefully built over decades. Their wealth, their secretive rituals, their ability to manipulate life itself, all of it had bought them the silence and protection they needed to continue their work, hidden in plain sight. And now, Ashford stood at the precipice, torn between his moral duty to expose the truth and the terrifying reality of what would happen to him if he did. Every attempt to uncover more had only led him deeper into a labyrinth of corruption. The names he had uncovered, powerful doctors, influential political figures, had ties to the Follings, ties that were not easily severed. When he had first begun his investigation, he had assumed that the Follings were merely wealthy, eccentric figures driven by greed and ambition. But now, as he pieced together the fragments of their history, he saw the true scope of their depravity. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about control, about harnessing power over life itself. They had the means to erase any trace of their actions, to make any accusation disappear as easily as the blood that flowed in their rituals. And Ashford, with all his education and training, felt small in the face of such darkness. He had spent his life studying the human body, learning its weaknesses, its strengths. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the evil that hid beneath the Follings' veneer of normalcy. They were not just hiding in plain sight. They were weaving a web of influence that no one could escape. The more Ashford thought about it, the more he realized the true extent of his dilemma. If he exposed the Follings, if he dared to speak the truth, it would not just cost him his career, his reputation. It could cost him his life. The Follings were not merely a couple of disturbed individuals. They were the center of a vast, silent network of power, a network that had its roots deep in the heart of society. Exposing them would not just bring down their house, it would expose the very foundations of a corrupt system that had long been buried beneath the surface. One evening Ashford sat alone in his office, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had spent hours poring over his notes, searching for a way out of the tangled mess that had become his life. He had met with people who had once worked for the Follings, former servants and colleagues who had once trusted the couple, but now their faces were clouded with fear. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the door as they relayed their stories. They had seen things that were too horrible to recount fully, but none of them had ever dared to go to the authorities. The Follings' reach was too great. Ashford had tried once to talk to the local magistrate, but the man had dismissed his concerns with a wave of the hand, assuring him that the Follings were nothing more than benefactors to the town. Ashford knew then that there would be no help from outside. The town, with all its quiet whispers and fearful glances, had already been bought. But Ashford could not turn away from the truth. He had seen the signs too clearly now, the unnatural pallor of the children, the strange rituals that took place under the guise of medical treatment, the mysterious disappearances. These were not the acts of a normal family, they were the actions of something much darker, something that should not be allowed to continue. Yet even as the truth clawed at his conscience, he found himself paralyzed. The Follings had anticipated his every move. They had made sure that anyone who came too close to the truth would be silenced. He had spoken to people in the medical community, but even the most respected doctors seemed unwilling to acknowledge the things Ashford had seen. Some had even gone so far as to suggest that his mind was playing tricks on him, that his concerns were the result of overwork or stress. The truth, Ashford realized with horror, was that no one was willing to stand against the Follings, not when their power extended so far, not when the consequences of defying them were so grave. The children, the ones who had come to the Follings with hope in their eyes, had been reduced to nothing more than sacrifices in the Follings' twisted game. Ashford had watched them with growing horror as they faded, their once bright eyes clouded with confusion and fear. They had been broken in ways he could not comprehend, their spirits crushed by the rituals, their bodies drained of the very essence that made them human. And as he stood there in his office, torn between duty and fear, Ashford knew that the truth was far more horrifying than he had ever imagined. The Follings were not just criminals, they were something else. Something that transcended the boundaries of human understanding. Their evil was not bound by the laws of man. It was something ancient, something that had been hidden for centuries, and now it had found a way to take root in the very heart of society. Ashford's heart beat faster as he stood up from his desk, pacing the room in a frenzy. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the pressure of the Follings' grip tightening with every passing moment. The more he learned, the more he realized that there was no escape from them. Not without consequences. They had made sure of that. His duty as a physician, his moral obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves, clashed violently with the reality of the situation. If he exposed the Follings, he would be branded a madman, a liar, and worse. He might disappear like so many others. But if he stayed silent, if he allowed this evil to continue unchecked, then he too would be complicit in their crimes. Ashford's gaze shifted to the window, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. The night was dark, the village quiet, and yet in that silence he could feel the presence of something far more sinister. The Follings were still out there, their influence still growing, their grip on the town as tight as ever. And Ashford knew, with a deep, gut-wrenching certainty, that whatever decision he made, he would never be free of them. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and there was no way to escape it. No matter what he chose, the Follings had already won. The night had come, and with it the final stage of the Follings' dark work. The house stood silent, its windows drawn tight against the outside world, its halls empty of sound except for the occasional whisper of footsteps. But inside there was a palpable tension, an air thick with anticipation. The Follings had prepared for this night for years, and now, at long last, the culmination of their rituals was at hand. Edward Folling stood at the center of the vast chamber, his eyes gleaming with a cold fire. Eleanor stood beside him, her face unreadable, her gaze fixed upon the children. They were already gathered, each one drugged into a state of numb obedience, their bodies weak and trembling from the constant toll the rituals had taken on them. The children were no longer the vibrant, frightened souls they had been upon arrival. They were empty shells, their spirits long since drained by the Follings' cruel manipulations. The Follings had chosen the children carefully. Each one had been broken in their own way, physically, emotionally, psychologically. Their wills had been shattered, their memories erased, and now they were ready to serve the Follings' ultimate purpose. They had become nothing more than tools for the final harvest. There were 6 of them arranged in a line before the altar, their eyes glazed, their bodies too weak to fight. They could not move, could not resist, as the Follings' ritual began. The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder, the shadows creeping across the walls like living things. In the center of the room stood the device, a strange contraption that seemed to belong in some forgotten age, its purpose shrouded in mystery. It was known only as the hourglass. The Follings had kept its true function hidden from the world, but tonight it would serve as the instrument of their final, most twisted act. Edward Folling stepped forward, his hands raised to the device. It was large, almost intimidating. A metal frame encasing a series of sharp, twisting wires that led into a central mechanism. It was designed to manipulate the nervous system, a cruel device that would slowly drain the life force from the children over the course of hours. The process was drawn out deliberately, agonizingly slow to ensure maximum suffering. It was not death they sought, not yet. The Follings desired something far darker, control over life itself. The child who was chosen first was barely conscious, her small body trembling as she was guided to the contraption. The others were forced to watch, their eyes vacant, their minds too foggy to comprehend the horror unfolding before them. As the child was secured into the device, her body stiffened in fear, but she was too weak to resist. Eleanor whispered something in her ear, a soothing sound meant to calm her, but it was a hollow comfort. There was no escaping what had been set in motion. Edward began the ritual with a chant, his voice low and rhythmic, the words foreign and ancient, passed down through generations of those who had learned to manipulate the forces of life. As he spoke, the device began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into the bones of the children. The first child's body jerked, as if caught in a violent tremor. Her muscles tensed, then relaxed, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the wires of the hourglass connected to her nervous system. The sensation was almost impossible to describe, an unrelenting pressure that spread through her body, gradually sapping her strength. The device worked by stimulating the nervous system in such a way that every nerve became hypersensitive. Every movement, every breath felt like 1,000 needles pressing against her skin. Her body fought to stay conscious, but the pain was too great, the force of the life-draining ritual overwhelming her. As the seconds stretched into minutes, she began to scream, her mouth open in a silent howl, but no sound escaped. The air was too thick with the hum of the device, too thick with the terrible, unnatural force it was channeling. Her body shuddered, convulsed, but the scream never came. The others watched, wide-eyed, too frightened to move. They had been through the rituals before, but nothing like this. This was something far worse, far more intimate. They could feel it in their bones, the creeping sense of their own powerlessness, their own vulnerability. The ritual was not just a means of sacrifice, it was a manipulation of life itself, a cruel game of control. The Follings were not just taking life from these children, they were playing God, testing the very boundaries of what it meant to be human. Minutes passed, then hours. The child's body had begun to wither, her skin paling to an unnatural hue, her body becoming more and more frail. She had been drained, her life force slowly siphoned away, but she was not dead. Not yet. She was still alive, her body suspended in a state of tortured suspension between life and death. It was a state that no living thing should ever have to endure, and yet in the Follings' world it was the ultimate expression of their power. The ritual continued, methodical and precise, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, the child's body went still. Her breath stopped, and the last of her life force was consumed by the hourglass. Edward stepped away, his face impassive, as if the act had been nothing more than another day's work. But beneath the surface there was something else. A hunger, a dark satisfaction that glimmered in his eyes. Eleanor, too, watched the child's body with a detached expression, as though she had long since become numb to the horror of what they were doing. The others were not spared the same fate. One by one they were led to the device, each one suffering the same drawn-out agony, each one's life slipping away slowly, painfully. The Follings did not show mercy. They did not care for the pain they caused. They were concerned only with the end result, the power they would gain, the life they would sustain. The night stretched on, the screams of the children muffled by the hum of the machine, their bodies racked with convulsions as their lives were drained away. When the ritual finally came to an end and the children were nothing but lifeless husks, the Follings stood over them, their faces unreadable. The room was silent save for the soft rhythmic ticking of the hourglass. The power they sought had been achieved, but at what cost? The house, the town, the world. None of it would ever be the same again. The Follings had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and their victory was as hollow as the bodies they left behind. The evil they had unleashed would never truly be contained. It would linger in the air, in the walls of the house, in the memories of those who had witnessed it. It would follow them all like a shadow, forever. The Follings had harvested more than just souls that night. They had harvested something far darker, the very essence of humanity itself, and the world would never know the full extent of their horrors. Dr. Henry Ashford had spent months gathering evidence, trying to piece together the grim puzzle of the Follings. But it was not until he uncovered a series of letters long buried in a forgotten archive that the true depth of their connection to power was revealed. As he sifted through the yellowed papers, a sense of dread began to creep over him. These were not just documents of correspondence. They were secrets buried by those who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The letters, written by an unnamed courtier, chronicled the Follings' rise from obscurity to influence, but more disturbingly, they revealed a chilling truth: their connection to Queen Victoria's court. The first letter was addressed to a high-ranking official in the royal family, a man whose name had been erased from history but whose influence had been felt across the empire. The Follings, it seemed, had ingratiated themselves with the most powerful figures in the kingdom, offering their strange services in exchange for protection. The letter spoke of favors granted, of shadows exchanged for power, and of whispered promises that kept the Follings' activities hidden from the public eye. There was a line in one of the final letters that chilled Ashford to the core. "The crown cannot afford the truth. The Follings must remain untouched for the sake of the kingdom." Ashford could hardly believe what he was reading. The monarchy, an institution that had once been revered, was complicit in the Follings' monstrous deeds. They were not just blind to the horrors taking place in Darlington. They had actively protected the Follings, covering up their darkest secrets. The implications were staggering. Ashford had suspected that the Follings' wealth had come from sources far darker than mere inheritance, but he had never imagined that such an entrenched web of corruption could exist. He felt the ground shift beneath him as he realized that he was not just dealing with a pair of psychopaths. He was facing an institution that had become so intertwined with evil that it was willing to sacrifice innocence, to shield the guilty, all for the sake of its own survival. The letters were damning, but it was a second, more cryptic document that revealed the true scope of the Follings' influence. It was a royal decree signed by Queen Victoria herself, granting the Follings a permanent position within the royal household under the guise of advisors on matters of health and longevity. The document was a cold, bureaucratic endorsement of their work, cloaking it in legitimacy, allowing them to operate freely within the corridors of power. But the language of the decree left no room for doubt. The Follings were not just trusted members of society, they were protectors of a deeper, darker secret. They were being kept hidden not because they were valuable to the crown, but because their actions had become indispensable to it. The letter alluded to the Follings' experiments that could extend life, that could defy the natural order of things. The monarchy, it seemed, was not just afraid of the truth coming to light. They were afraid of losing the power they had gained through such unholy means. The Follings had become a necessary evil, a quiet force that propped up the fragile illusion of royal stability. The monarchy had sanctioned their actions, and now it was clear. The Follings were untouchable. As Ashford read through the final pages, he understood the magnitude of what he was facing. This wasn't just about a corrupt family hiding their crime. It was about a system that had been complicit in the evil for so long that it had become part of its foundation. The Follings had not only been allowed to operate, they had been empowered, shielded by those who feared the collapse of the entire institution if the truth were revealed. As he sat in his study, the weight of the knowledge pressed heavily on him. The Follings' reign of terror was not just a local matter. It was part of something far greater. The corruption ran deep, so deep in fact that even the highest offices in the land had been compromised. And yet, as Ashford looked at the papers before him, he knew that there was little he could do with this information. Who would believe him? The monarchy, the people in power, the very forces that controlled the fabric of society were the ones who had concealed the truth. If he went public with what he had uncovered, he would be branded a madman, a liar, or worse, a traitor. The royal family could never allow such a scandal to be exposed, and Ashford knew all too well how easily people could vanish when they were inconvenient. The Follings were not just a threat to the children they had tormented. They were a threat to the very institution of power itself. The horror he had uncovered would never be allowed to see the light of day. The system was too entrenched, too powerful to be dismantled by one man's conscience. The consequences of exposing the Follings would go far beyond his own life. The monarchy would fall, the public's trust would be shattered, and the very foundation of society would crumble under the weight of the truth. Ashford's mind raced as he tried to understand the full implications of his discovery. He had always believed in the righteousness of his profession, in the value of truth and justice. But now, standing at the precipice, he saw the futility of it all. The world had become a place where power, not morality, dictated the rules. The Follings, in their twisted pursuit of immortality, had manipulated not only life, but the very institutions that were supposed to protect it. The kingdom had become a mirror of their evil, one where the truth was no longer important, where the lives of the innocent could be sacrificed for the preservation of the powerful. The silence of the king, the silence of the royal family, was the silence of complicity. And in that silence the Follings had thrived. Ashford's hands trembled as he placed the letters back in the drawer, sealing them away as if the knowledge itself might consume him. He knew what he had to do now. He could not expose the Follings, not without tearing down the very fabric of the kingdom. The monarchy would protect them, and anyone who dared to challenge their authority would be swallowed by the system. The truth, as ugly as it was, would remain hidden. The Follings would continue their work, unchecked, hidden behind the gilded walls of power. The horror they had unleashed would never be known to the world. The Follings had found their place in the dark corners of history, and no one would ever dare disturb them. The king's silence had become a seal of approval, a shield that protected their reign of terror. And Ashford, torn between his duty to expose the truth and the overwhelming force of the institution he had once trusted, realized that in this world some truths were too dangerous to be spoken. Dr. Ashford had spent every waking hour in a fevered pursuit of the truth, piecing together the dark fragments of the Follings empire. His office was littered with papers, documents, letters, accounts from those who had worked in the shadows of the Follings' home. Desperate whispers of the horrors he had uncovered. The weight of it was suffocating. Every new revelation sent a ripple of terror through him, but he knew that this was his last chance. The Follings had to be stopped. The truth had to be exposed. He had gathered the evidence, official documents from the royal court, personal testimonies, and the final letter from an anonymous witness who had once served the Follings. This was it. His plan was simple. He would go to the press, to those few in power who might still care for justice. He would show them the depth of the corruption that had tainted the highest echelons of society. The world would finally know the true face of the Follings, no longer hidden by wealth or influence. But as he made his way through the dark streets of Darlington, a sense of unease settled over him. It was too easy. It had been too easy to gather the evidence. His heart raced, and doubt gnawed at his conscience, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and if he didn't act, the Follings would continue their reign of terror unchallenged. As Ashford reached the inn where he had arranged to meet the journalist, his steps faltered. He noticed the figure in the shadows, the unmistakable figure of Edward Follings standing just outside the inn's door. A chill ran down Ashford's spine. How could he have known? He had been careful. He had covered his tracks. But there was no doubt now. The Follings knew what he was doing. The door creaked open before Ashford could react. Edward smiled, his lips stretching into a cold, calculating grin that sent a wave of sickness through Ashford's chest. "Dr. Ashford," Edward said, his voice calm but laced with an eerie edge. "I think you've made a grave mistake." Ashford's breath caught in his throat as the darkness around them seemed to thicken. It was not just Edward. There were others emerging from the shadows, figures cloaked in secrecy, their faces hidden behind hoods and veils. They were the Follings' most trusted allies, men and women who had made their fortunes or silenced their enemies at the Follings' bidding. In that moment, Ashford realized the terrifying extent of their reach. They were untouchable not because of their wealth, but because of the power they had sown into the very fabric of society. The truth was meaningless to them. Their influence was so vast it could crush anyone who dared to challenge them. Before Ashford could speak, before he could plead or explain his intentions, one of the figures moved quickly, slipping a cloth over his mouth, and the world around him went black. His last conscious thought was the sickening realization that he had been outmaneuvered. The Follings had won. When he awoke, it was in a place that was neither here nor there. A dark room with no windows, no light, and no sound except for his own labored breathing. The rope around his wrists bit into his skin and his head throbbed painfully. He had been drugged, of course, anything to ensure that he wouldn't remember his abduction clearly. As his vision cleared, he saw the Follings standing before him, calm, unperturbed, as if this were some sort of twisted ritual they had done 1,000 times before. Eleanor Follings' eyes met his, and there was something in them, something that was as cold as it was knowing. "You think you could expose us, Doctor?" "Ashford," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "but you're just one man. The truth, your truth, means nothing to those who control the story." Edward stepped forward, his presence looming. "You've played your part, Doctor. You've gathered the pieces, but you failed to see the whole picture. You thought your evidence would topple us, but what you didn't realize is that the world we've built is untouchable. You can expose all the truth you want, but in the end, it's only our version that will ever be believed. The Follings are untouchable, and so is the narrative we've created. The truth will die with you." Ashford's mind raced. He had done everything right. He had followed the trail of blood, the endless whispers of those who had suffered, the children who had vanished. He had been careful, methodical, and yet now he was trapped. The Follings' grip on the truth was absolute, and no one, not even he, could break it. The walls had closed in. There was no escape. And then the twist came. It was slow, methodical, like a carefully executed play. Ashford's attempts to expose the Follings, to unravel the twisted truth, had been manipulated, twisted, and turned against him. The evidence he had gathered, proof of the Follings' monstrous deeds, was now being used as evidence of his own guilt. The authorities had been called, and it was not the Follings who were under suspicion, but Ashford. He was the one who was now accused of orchestrating the murders, of fabricating the horrors that had happened in that house. His name, once synonymous with integrity, was now stained with blood. They had framed him, the public, too quick to believe in the stories that had been fed to them, accepted the Follings' version of events. They had used their connections to silence his voice, to destroy any chance he had of clearing his name. His reputation was shattered, his credibility gone. The very truth that had driven him to this point, his final desperate attempt to expose the Follings, was now seen as the product of a disturbed mind, a man who had lost his grip on reality. He was nothing more than a scapegoat, a man whose final act of defiance had been turned into the thing that would destroy him. In the days that followed, Ashford could not escape the gnawing feeling that his worst fears had come true. The Follings had played the game better than he ever could have imagined. They had manipulated the narrative, spun it into something twisted and false, and now the world would never know what they had done. The children, the lives lost, the darkness that had tainted so many, none of it would matter. All that would remain was the Follings' version of the truth. Ashford's name would be forgotten, his story erased from the pages of history. He had been the last witness to their crimes, but in the end his voice was silenced by the very system that had protected them. And as the years passed, the Follings would continue their work, their power unchallenged, their secrets safe in the shadows, while Ashford's name became a distant whisper in the wind, a man who had tried and failed to expose the truth. In the years after the Follings' fall, Darlington tried to heal, but their legacy clung to the town like mold in old wood, silent, rotting, impossible to scrape clean. The official version of events painted them as eccentric obsessives undone by delusions of immortality, but the townspeople knew better. Whispers lingered in alleyways, and though their house stood empty, the weight of what had happened there infected everything. The children they had broken were never named, their stories never fully told. In truth, the Follings hadn't just corrupted lives, they had corrupted trust itself. To protect reputations, the monarchy and its allies swept the bloodiest details under the rug. The horror didn't vanish, it was buried. In the years that followed, new child protection laws were rushed into place, institutions restructured, and oversight bodies established, measures meant to prevent another tragedy. But deep down, people knew the truth had been traded for the illusion of progress. The survivors grew up in silence, scarred and forgotten, while the systems that once sheltered their abusers remained largely intact. The story of the Follings was not just one of cruelty. It was a study in how evil cloaks itself in respectability. They were not monsters in basements, they were dinner guests in palaces. They thrived because no one dared to look too closely. And though their name faded from headlines, the quiet terror they represented never left. Evil, after all, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles. The question that remained unspoken but ever present was simple. How many more walk among us, still hidden, still protected, still waiting